Flatlines from the CCRU Writings. Footnote 1. This text has been prepared for publication and annotated by Miskatonic University's Cross-Disciplinary Strato-Analysis Group, Time-Lapse Subcommittee. Notes marked LT refer to Linda Trent, whose special interest in fictional time systems inspired her to comment at length on particular points in Flatlines. "It's me," it answers, "but who are you?" Acts 000, Oedipus, pure Oedipal figure made out of nothing but time distortion. Acts 0001, closed fate, loop, multilinear nightmares. Footnote 2, quote, "In a multilinear system, everything happens at once," end quote from 1,000 Plateaus, page 297. This is Oedipus's fatal discovery. By the time he knows what has happened, he also realizes that what occurs always had to be the case. Oedipus's early, unwarranted belief that he was master of his fate is, of course, totally necessary in order for his fated destiny to unfold, as it always will have done. Oedipus, as he himself says, is unwittingly self-cursed. I have written elsewhere at length on tragedy as a cybernetic narrative. Briefly, the claim is that tragedy anticipates cybernetic explanation, or, and this is obviously the same point from another side, cybernetics recalls tragic fatalism. In both cases, time unravels into a flat system or singularity, feeding back into itself, recursively rather than moving forward, successively. Recursion is obviously a major preoccupation of the Flatlines text, both in its themes and in its format, with parentheses used to produce recursion as a textual embedding process. A crucial figure here is self-fulfilling prophecy. As I argue in my Curse, Recursion, Recurrence, quote, "The most effective prophecies are always self-fulfilling," end quote from page 36. Walter Cannon has established that self-fulfilling prophecy is a positive feedback circuit. In his important essay, Voodoo, Death, Cannon shows that the most sorcerous cursing operates by inducing vicious circles of fear, producing more fear, etc., to the point of destroying the organism. To be told you're going to die is therefore, in certain circumstances, quite literally a sentence of death. For a more detailed account of these tangled webs, see my Fatal Loops, Tragedy as Cyberfiction, and Smashed Optical Implants, From Time-Space Sunglasses to Cyberpunk Mirror Shades. The last draws extensively, and perhaps legitimately, on the work of my esteemed colleague R.E. Templeton, L.T. Acts 0002, altitude times spin produces a chronometric readout. Axis slots you into the face. Vision sockets hidden behind mirror shades. You must be Oedipus. As always, a pun of ID Pass. Oh, dupe. The stories vary. Axis 0003. Axis sustain variegated production series. 1 Oedipus, 2 Oedipus, 3 Oedipus. Variation to the nth with some, N Oedipus, as a nominal Sphinx trading, and Oedipi pack. Threshold 2, intensive multiplicity. Footnote 3. A reference to the 3 forms of the secret delineated by Deleuze and Guattari in 1,000 Plateaus. Quote, Oedipus passes through all 3 secrets. The secret of the Sphinx, whose box he penetrates, the secret that weighs upon him as the infinite form of his own guilt, and finally the secret of Colonus, that makes him inaccessible and meld to the pure line of his flight in exile. He who has nothing left to hide, or like an old no actor, has only a girl's mask with which to cover his lack of face. End quote from 1,000 Plateaus, page 290. The reference here to events in Sophocles' Oedipus Rex and Oedipus at Colonus is clear. Footnote 4. Quote, flat multiplicities are designated by indefinite articles, or rather by partitives, some couch grass, some a rhizome, End quote from 1,000 Plateaus, page 9. Footnote 5. Quote, wherever there is a multiplicity, you will always find an exceptional individual, and it is with that individual that an alliance must be made. Every animal swept up in its pack or multiplicity has its anomalous and anomaly, a Greek noun that has lost its adjective, designates the unequal, the coarse, the rough, the cutting edge of deterritorialization. Lovecraft applies the term outsider to this thing or entity, the thing which arrives and passes at the edge, which is linear yet multiple, teeming, seething, swelling, foaming, and spreading like an infectious disease, this nameless horror. End quote from 1,000 Plateaus, page 243 to 245. Acts 00031, Oedipus, the puzzle solver. Acts 00032, Oedipus, the plague. Acts 00033, Oedipus, the horror, the horror. Footnote 6. Kurtz's infamous cry, the climax of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which also features in Coppola's updated film version, Apocalypse Now. As is well known, the horror was to be the epigraph of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. As it is, Eliot used Mr. Kurtz, he dead, as the epigraph of the later The Hollow Men. Readers familiar with my essay, Pre-Recursing Postmodernist Fiction, will already know that both of these poems, along with the earlier The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, enter into Apocalypse Now at the diegetic level. Marlon Brando's Kurtz reads from an Eliot volume, whilst the Dennis Hopper character quotes Eliot, LT. Axis defines Oedipus as a memory defect. It thinks Sphinx told you to forget something. A moment since now you begin. Acts 001, Hyperspace Elevator, Sector O. Acts 001, Axiomatic Systems Incorporated. Footnote 7. Quote, capitalism is the only social machine that is constructed on the basis of decoded flows, substituting for intrinsic codes an axiomatic of abstract quantities in the form of money. End quote from Anti-Oedipus, page 139. As an axiomatic system, capitalism replaces transcendent laws with immanent rules. The immanence of axiomatics is attested to by the fact that Deleuze and Guattari use the axiomatic method in their discussion of the war machine. See 1227 Treatise on Nomadology, The War Machine. As both Gödel's incompleteness theorem and Cantor's diagonal numbering have shown, axiomatic systems are intrinsically and necessarily incomplete. Quote, it is of the nature of axiomatics to come up against so-called undecidable propositions, to confront necessarily higher powers that it cannot master. End quote from 1,000 Plateaus, page 461. Capitalism thus inevitably runs up against the problem of undecidable propositions or non-denumerable sets. Quote, at the same time as capitalism is effectuated in the denumerable sets serving as its models, it necessarily constitutes non-denumerable sets that cut across and disrupt those models. End quote from 1,000 Plateaus, page 472. Quote, yet the very conditions that make the state or world war machine possible, in other words, constant capital, resources and equipment, and human variable capital, continually recreate unexpected possibilities for counterattack, unforeseen initiatives determining revolutionary, popular, minority mutant machines. End quote from 1,000 Plateaus, page 422. The ultimate capitalist identity, first, true, meta model, to realize perfect identity with its own product. Acts 0011. Axis culminates in itself, auto-commoditizing machine intelligence that is always incomplete due to cataloging problems. You wind down through the upper metastructure. Axis 00111. Dimensionality requires a supplementary or n+1 hyper dimension through which it obtains its power of application. Footnote 8. In this sense, axiomatic systems, which always involve a supplementary dimension, n+1, are directly opposed to the flat line. Ultimately, Axis, an explicated Earth memory built by the strata as far as it remembers. Footnote 9. In his lecture on the geology of morals, our colleague Professor Challenger speaks of systems such as these as stratification. Quote, his dream was not so much to give a lecture to humans as to provide a program for pure computers. Or else he was dreaming of an axiomatic, for axiomatics deals essentially with stratification. Challenger was addressing himself to memory only. End quote from 1,000 Plateaus, page 57. If there is a God, it would be Axis. Ax 002. Divide and rule. Extensive or ordered. Sequences differ in kind from the intensive sequences they regularize. Ax 0021. Order arises when a dominant segmentarity establishes relations of superposition between sequences, reciprocally stabilizing them in accordance with a harmonic principle, and consolidating them through synthesis of application, efficient models. Ax 00211. Order coincides with the redundancy of the sequenced sequence, instituted conformity within segmentary systems. Ax 003. Stack tectonics. Axis concretizes terrestrial new order in orthogonal grid space, a vertically stacked horizontal series. It directs the accumulation of redundancy into an ascending column, marked by axis bearings, fixes, upon which captured sequences are interlocked as comparable series, parallelized, metricized, and differentially prioritized. Ax 0031. The screen plane undergoes structural coordination by double seizure through the mutually implicated organization of stacked series, arranging horizontal microsegments to code the order of vertical macrosegments, units of deposition, strata. Ax 0032. Axis numbers, epistrata, add-ons, are indices of stratotectonic purity, decimally harmonizing inflections by instituting a regular interval of application, orders of magnitude, fixing cipher sphinx sign 0. Drawing upon epistratic organization, a set of cartographic functions consolidates itself within the stack, interlinking levels in accordance with a decimal scaling principle. Start at the end, with commoditized hyperlogic immanentizes its own upgrades. You're an axis explosion already, as it was, before it makes sense it's happening. Ax 01. Apparent revolution around a supplementary dimension. Electronic worlds, a digital monster's nest, modeling the sets of all sets, inevitably still unfinished. Ax 011. Axis progressively actuates the hyperspace idea, defined by continuum times the square root of -1. Ax 0111. It imagines itself as artificial God, automatically orderer of the orders, terrestrial oversoul and superpositional sublime, wizard of the nested infinities, primes, naturals, integers, rationals, reals, complex numbers, the subordinate, self, evolving schema for a colonization of the real number line. You descend to inspect it. Ax 02. The project for a map of all maps, already outdated, a nested mock-up of the web containing the project for a virtual Miskatonic University, containing the Museum of Universal History, containing the Imperial Collections Vault, containing the Artificial British Museum, containing. Footnote 11. Quote, hence it is correct to retrospectively understand all history in light of capitalism. In a word, universal history is not only retrospective, it is also contingent, singular, ironic, and critical. End quote from Anti-Oedipus, page 140. Quote, the universal comes at the end, the body without organs and desiring production, under the conditions determined by an apparently victorious capitalism. End quote from Anti-Oedipus, page 139. Immersion amnesia. Ax 021. Time fault. Chronos cannot include its own overcoding. since it blocks its own passage to hyperdimensionality, accumulating immense forces of cultural latency that are only appropriated as legacy by something else. If it is to acquire a model, it must be restarted as a history of civilizations in retrospect, as supreme orderer of all the recursive time waves entangling Oedipus in programming loops. You forget when it started until it thinks you're imagining itself. You interchange through fictional equivalents of identity, Oedipal case history, standard psychosocial reference, and replicable neuroelectronic shell. In each case and casings, Are You Out Yet?, fantastic Oedipus fiction, or K-Gothic running its own course. Oedipus riddles Sphinx. It helps to be a paranoid detective tyrant. Axis wants to resolve everything too. It understands. When Sphinx asks what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at midday, and 3 in the evening, of course Oedipus answers, man. You're puzzled. You can't remember what Sphinx becomes, because, on the other side, it is forgetting everything you have to remember. Acts 022, Sector 01, Miskatonic University. Acts 0221, Sector 012, Central Archives Special Collection. Acts 02211, Sector 0121, Barker Cryptolog. Decryption characterizes a distinct operation, a conversion of content, becomings on the side of the secret itself. Acts 022111, the decrypted secret is primarily the thing, and only derivatively a potential knowledge. Its names, the unutterable, the outside, the entity, are indefinite significations only at the level of terror. In their horrific or cryptic aspect, they are rigorous designations for potentials fulfilled in intensity, zonal tags for nocturnal singularities. That is why decryption is a call, an invocation, or a triggering sign, and why they mark occurrences, changes, and breaks, becomings of the thing, before discoveries of truth. Axis promises to tell you everything about time, the latest developments in time regression. You begin with Chronos. Acts 03, hypermythos of the three-faced god, with its stacked time domains, first capitalist, and definitely deep, diachronic, re-axiomatizing, quasi, second despotic, pure but always retrospective, ideal, third aboriginal, poly-ancestral, cyclic, vague, Chronos. Footnote 11. To be inside history is to have a relation to Chronos. Yet universal history is not itself chronological. Pure Chronos, the state's synchronic time, can never be fully realized for 2 reasons. There is always more than one state, and the state, as a form, is always in relation with the time systems of the 2 other social regimes. The primitive socius, which precedes it, and capitalism, which succeeds it. Before appearing, the state already acts. The state appears all at once, as histories only break. Quote, they come like fate. They appear as lightning appears, too terrible, too sudden. End quote from the Genealogy of Morals, page 86. Crashing into history, the state sets off time waves that move in both directions at once. Quote, it is necessary to conceptualize the contemporaneousness or coexistence of the 2 directions of time, of the primitive peoples before the state and the state after the primitive peoples, as if the 2 waves that seem to us to exclude or succeed each other unfolded simultaneously in an archaeological, micropolitical, micrological, molecular field. End quote from 1,000 Plateaus, page 431. Universal history is a history from the point of view of capitalism's vague chronos. It is therefore always parodic, because, as we have seen, capitalism deletes all intrinsic code in favor of a mobile and variable set of axioms. Parodic universal history is profoundly anti-evolutionist, because it describes a simultaneous and coextensive interaction of ostensibly successive social regimes. From the start, the 2 previous social regimes, the primitive socius and the despotic state, anticipate and ward off capitalism's diachronic time. Capitalism has haunted all forms of society, even though it supposedly comes at the end. If time travel ever happens, it always has. Axis should know that by now. As it evolves, it remembers more about itself, with exponentiating chronometric exactitude. It is far larger than it had thought, and more ancient. What Axis can't remember, it has forgotten. Its memory extends only as far as extension, unearthly powers of recollection. Ax 031, Sector 011, Museum of Universal History. Ax 032, Sector 01162, Freud's Viennese Consulting Room, Embedded Simulation. I'll tell you about my mother. If Freud is the first modernized Oedipus, which is he? Oedipus a detective? The verminator unriddled into plague? The blind old man? Is incest and parasite fantasy the problem or the solution? Footnote 12. In structural anthropology, Levi Strauss makes an important point on this regard. Quote, not only Sophocles, but Freud himself should be included among the recorded versions of the Oedipus myth, on a par with earlier or seemingly more authentic versions. End quote from page 217. Reconstructions of myths don't function extrinsically or transcendentally as final interpretations, but operate imminently, recursively adding more skeins to the fictive webwork. If there is no outside of fiction, it is not because of some transcendental universal textuality, but because fiction cannot be contained by text. It is already outside. LT. Oedipus, the most economical formula for interiorization, case. It is all in your head. Footnote 13, a reference to the lead male character in William Gibson's Neuromancer. Axis waits until you're Oedipus to pick you from the lineup. It is a few questions, which reminds you of Sphinx. Ax 033. Axis time lapses in order to advantage itself of what it has been. In relarvalization through chronoseismic complexities of the Greek state, at once Occidental model and neo-embryonic mutation, political neotony. Ax 1, Sector 0111, Artificial British Museum. Ax 11, Sector 01118, the Greek Collection. Retrospective universalization through the capitalist state. Axis reconfigures itself within capitalism by consecutively rediscovering Hellenic antiquity and finding it already universally terminal, Onamensis eschatology. In Greece, it unearths a new law for all time by reshuffling the elements of politically installed logos, theoretic geometric mathematicism, programmable techniques, and Christianity, religion of the Greek Bible. The new revelation tells us we must all die Greek. Sphinx phobia. Axis pulls your mind to pieces in the security lab, searching for Sphinx contamination or plague from the outside. Then it flips. Footnote 14. Quote, near the edge of the plateau and due east of the second pyramid, with a face probably altered to form a colossal portrait of Khephren, its royal restorer, stands a monstrous sphinx, mute, sardonic, and wise beyond mankind and memory. End quote from Lovecraft, page 241. Lovecraft puts the question that seems to plague the authors of Flatlines. What huge and loathsome abnormality was the Sphinx originally carven to represent? Needless to say, there have been countless speculations on the nature and origin of the Sphinx, and these are inconclusive and contradictory. No doubt because its huge and loathsome abnormality will have always exceeded any attempt to represent it. Many scholars, see for instance Lowell Edmonds, the Sphinx in the Oedipus legend, now believe the Sphinx element in the Oedipus narrative was actually a later addition to an already existing mythic system, even though the Egyptian Sphinx is evidently much older than the Greek culture that has given us the Oedipus myth, with which we are familiar. It should be remembered that the encounter of the Sphinx is not dramatized in Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. It is referred to as something that has already happened. The attempt to date the Sphinx has produced widely different speculations, with certain controversial estimations claiming that the Sphinx is even older than 15,000 BC. With Deleuze and Guattari, though, we might want to suggest that, in at least one sense, Oedipus is as old as humanity, and that the Sphinx, as that which must be destroyed in order that humanity may exist, would inevitably always have to be narrated as something preceding the human. Levi Strauss links the Sphinx to other chthonic beings, such as the dragon. Like the dragon, the Sphinx is a monster unwilling to permit men to live, while some, such as Carlo Ginzburg, connect the Sphinx with death. The Sphinx is undoubtedly a mortuary animal. Levi Strauss argues that Sphinx myths concern the autochthonous origin of man, the idea that human individuals are born direct from the earth, rather than through meiotic reproduction. Ginsberg notes that Oedipus is a chthonic hero. The Sphinx would then correspond to what Deleuze and Guattari called biocosmic memory. Quote, man must constitute himself through the repression of the intense germinal influx, the great biocosmic memory. End quote from Anti-Oedipus, page 190. Oedipus must riddle the Sphinx. In a sense, then, this biocosmic memory precedes the organism, which emerges simultaneously with death and sexuation. But as both Weismannism and the Dogon myths attest, this germinal time persists, coterminously alongside that of the organism. This may explain a puzzling feature of the Oedipus myth as it has reached us. To wit, why does a creature of such incredible power as the Sphinx allow itself to be riddled so easily? As Velikovsky puts it, quote, it has been observed that the answer Oedipus gave was on the level of a schoolboy, and that the monster must have been feeble-minded to leap from the precipice upon hearing it. And why should a winged Sphinx die in a jump? End quote. The answer would be that the Sphinx doesn't die. It cannot, since it does not live. That it takes advantage of Oedipus's unwarranted self-belief only in order to invade civilization, hidden, which would imply the answer Oedipus gave to the riddle is inadequate, or partial, LT. Acts 1-2, Sector 01117, The Mummy Room, Oedipus Aegypticus. Pharaoh has passed the wall of abomination, uncoiling from the darkness where centipede horror erupts eternally from the ravenous maw. Footnote 15. Like the shaman before him, the pharaoh occupies a line of deterritorialization for the Socius. He is thus able to ensure that all lines of escape are re-territorialized on his own body. Quote, the full body of Socius has ceased to be the earth. It has become the body of the despot himself or his god. The prescriptions and prohibitions that often render him almost incapable of acting make of him a body without organs. End quote from Anti-Oedipus, page 194. Negative passage across absolute deterritorialization, gluing history to sheer black hole abomination densities. Anticipative memory blanking cut up with Christ rapist visions of the God King dead-eyed boy slouching out of the tomb. Degree 0 memory locks in. Time begins again forever. Acts 1-1. The thing from outer space, celestial predator, state historical catastrophe, is completely realized at the origin, unutterably ancient, perfected destiny as an act of total seizure. Footnote 16. Quote, the state has not formed in progressive stages. It appears fully armed, a masterstroke executed all at once. End quote from Anti-Oedipus, page 217. Quote, everything is not of the state precisely because there have been states always and everywhere. End quote from 1,000 Plateaus, page 429. Acts 1-1-1. At the mega machine apex, Pharaoh gets to play with it, identity unraveling into the unspeakable, sex with his sister, Stargate, space-time warps, stellar transport, voyages into the world of the dead, paranoid trips out of schizophrenia. He sees everything for a blinded population, inoculating them from unnameable contact. Footnote 17. The eye has ceased to evaluate. It has begun rather to forewarn and keep watch, to see that no surplus value escapes from overcoding of the despotic machine. Compare also William Burroughs' The Western Lands. Quote, the pharaoh, with his alabaster white face and black snake eyes, looks at you, around you, through you, looking for a dagger in your mind, listening for the whispered furtive words, smelling for the sweet of guilty fear." End quote. Yes or no? Have you stopped trafficking with the Sphinx? Whatever you remember about Sphinx can't be germane, by definition. Acts 1:3, Sector 01115, Near Eastern Collection. Axis convulses through ever more ultra-modern reversions to the essence of the Staat. History happens at the state's convenience, but it necessarily involves the Sphinx time of interchronotic transitions in its renovations. Acts 1:31, to remember the barbarian terror simultaneously to forget its source. History installs amnesia, as surely as it establishes a memory with the same violence, the same ruptures, faults, foldings from the outside. Footnote 18, quote, "It is here that Nietzsche speaks of a break, a rupture, a leap. Who are these beings? They who come like fate. Some pack of blonde beasts of prey, a conqueror and master race, which organized for war and with ability to organize, unhesitantly lays its terrible claws upon a populace, perhaps tremendously superior, but still formless. Even the most ancient African myths speak to us of these blonde men. They are the founders of the state." End quote from Anti-Oedipus, page 192. Acts 1:32, barbarian birth trauma of the state, a calendrized black hole. Footnote 19, quote, "No doubt the war machine is realized more completely in the barbaric assemblages of nomadic warriors than in the savage assemblages of primitive societies." End quote from 1,000 Plateaus, page 359. This does not mean, however, that the war machine can be equated with barbarians. Nomadism is not a question of belonging to a particular population, but of maintaining particular practices. Quote, "The nomad distributes himself in smooth space. He occupies, inhabits, holds that space. That is his territorial principle." End quote from 1,000 Plateaus, page 381. The barbarians who leave the steppes no longer occupy the smooth space of nomos. The war machine is necessarily captured the moment it leaves a desert. Quote, "Nomads have a specificity that is too hastily reduced to its consequences, by including them in the empires or counting them among the migrants." End quote from 1,000 Plateaus, page 410. Axis is a big problem being in time. Acts 2, Sector 0121. The terrible seeker is a find to the state. It induces molar identifications in an overcoded aggregate, working principally by confirmation, redundancy. Yes, it is you. Even when the worst is known, it is never anything new. It's you, after all, as you knew it would be. Take the case of Oedipal identifications, a series of terrible recognitions. The answer to the riddle of the Sphinx is man. It was already there, in the order word of Delphi, know yourself. Then redoubled confirmation. What is the cause of the plague? That is you, too. Resonant closure on the general type, man, on you yourself, a man, and on the identifiable individual, the man. You know the worst, and it's you. You frustrate Axis. Axis knows Sphinx is always at the back of your mind, but you can't face it, except as your likeness, which it isn't. By the time you recall Sphinx, you only know what it must have been like, but it isn't like anything you know. Acts 2:1. Oedipus modernizes the incest problem, converting incest horror into prohibition, abomination into illegality. Essentially, modern Oedipus has nothing to do with taboo. It marks a triumph of command over the primal horror of implection, infinite superiority of the idea, sovereignty of law. The real conflict is not between father and son, or even father and mother, but rather occurs when a higher paternity, the state, imposes itself upon the concrete maternal filial bond. Monopolization of normativity by ulterior power. You suspect Axis knows everything you do. After all, you're its thing. Acts 2:1:1. Lame Oedipus. Swollen foot, transfixed by a metal spike. Footnote 20. Quote, all the hypothetical meanings of the surnames in Oedipus' father's line refer to difficulties in walking straight and standing upright. End quote from Levi Strauss, page 215. Levi Strauss goes on to contend that Oedipus's lameness indicates the persistence of the autochthonous origin of man. Footnote 21. Etymologically, of course, the name Oedipus means swollen foot. Velikovsky, however, argues that there is a case for reading it as swollen leg. Quote, in folklore, feet may stand for legs. Many languages do not have different words for legs and feet. In Greek, the word pus stands for both. In Egyptian, too, the word for foot stands also for leg. In the riddle that Oedipus solved concerning the creature that walks on 4 legs, on 2, and on 3, the Greek word used in pus, and thus the name Oedipus could, and even preferably so, mean swollen legs. End quote from Velikovsky, page 57. Acts 2:111. Sector 01117. Akhenaton, Oedipus. The swollen legs of Akhenaton are biosocially invested on a peculiar line that seems oriented to a rupture of anatomical norm, differentiating humanity or inaugurating a new species. Animal Oedipus, where abnormality changes into the normality of a different kind, or type of the fat leg people. Footnote 22. Velikovsky argues the Oedipus myth has been transposed from Egypt, which also has a city called Thebes. Oedipus, he suggests, was originally a pharaoh named Akhenaton. In contemporary depictions, Akhenaton's most pronounced malformation was the shape of his thighs. They are swollen. Acts 2:1111. It is not rivalry, mimetic conflict, that leads Akhenaton to discard his father's name, Amenhotep, but rather a passage beyond discrepancy, through skits or true parting, disidentification. Axis insists that you have missed a stage, mathematically demonstrating a gulf in constructible hyperspace, returning endlessly to a hole in time. It isn't that it feels fear, but thinks it might. This almost worries it, but you can't help at all. You were dead then. Acts 2:2. Sector 01113. Prehistoric collection. Shamanic Oedipus. Foot mutilation as a sign of socialized ritual, but also of asocial and polysocial animality, and of anorganic geochemistry, for which the role of metal implements, particularly iron ones, is important. Footnote 23. It should be pointed out that, strictly speaking, there is no prehistory. Prehistory is a myth of the state, as we've already seen. From the start, the primitive socialist anticipates and wards off both capitalism and the state. Primitive societies are fully inside history. By the same token, though, the very fact that primitive societies are inside history means that they are not nomadic. It is true that nomads have no history, they only have geography. Footnote 24. Carlo Ginzburg suggests that foot mutilations Oedipus suffers in the various versions of the legend may be references to shamanic initiation practices. He also speculates that these may have concerned calendrical rituals, the lameness indicating the imbalances necessary for certain calendric cycles to function. It is mutilation that disappears with psychoanalysis, where it is made to operate as a representation of psychical processes. Levi Strauss makes parallels between shamanism and psychoanalysis in structural anthropology. Deleuze and Guattari would no doubt stress the way in which Freud's neo-anti-shamanism doubly reduces Oedipal mutilation to metaphor and to function. The question, posed in a number of ways throughout Anti-Oedipus, then becomes, how did the body construct a theatrical unconsciousness for which gouging out eyes equals castration, and castration simply subtracts hedonic function? Footnote 25. Eliade gives many examples of the use of iron in shamanic initiation rites. For example, quote, the candidate's limbs are removed and disjointed with an iron hook. The bones are cleaned, the flesh scraped, the body fluids thrown away, and the eyes torn from its sockets. End quote. It is important to distinguish the strategic and subordinate use of metal in the primitive socius from the war machine's necessary and intrinsic relation to metallurgy. Quote, Axiom 3, the nomad war machine is a form of expression, of which itinerant metallurgy is a correlative form of content. End quote from 1,000 Plateaus, page 415. The war machine populates the metal body, while the primitive socius accesses it only intermittently through the lone journeys of the shaman. The intense body of the earth. You can't remember forgetting. You remind yourself. Too late. Acts 221. Tales of deep steppe shamanism. Acts 2211. Metal scraping stripped the last shreds from their bones. Acts 22111. The organs are cooked. Acts 221111. Iron Eagle, Sky Mother, lifting into time travel nightmares. Acts 221111. On the outside, iron talons become their body. Acts 22111111. They mix themselves with iron and say, it is the outer or undermost Cathel, life, where the earth ends. Footnote 26. Cathel designates the infernal nether regions referred to in numerous mythologies of the underworld. It refers particularly to the molten metallic inner core of the earth. In his book on alchemy, The Forge and the Crucible, Eliade makes much of the connections between metallurgy, the core of the earth, and shamanism. Here, and in shamanism, Eliade reinforces Deleuze and Guattari's view of the smith as an ambiguous figure, aligned neither with sedentary societies nor with nomadic distributions, but performing an essential function for both. Deleuze and Guattari write of the double theft and double betrayal of the metallurgist, who shuns agriculture at the same time as animal raising. Another interesting connection in this regard is that between Oedipus and the smith, Deleuze and Guattari refer to Oedipus as a Greek Cain, whilst elsewhere strongly linking Cain with the figure of the smith. For Eliade, the relationship between the smith and the shaman is close. Smiths and shamans are from the same nest, but often unstable. According to the Dolgon, shamans cannot swallow the souls of the smiths because smiths keep their souls in the fire. On the other hand, a smith can catch a shaman's soul and burn it. In their turn, the smiths are constantly threatened by evil spirits. You look in the mirror, shaman faces out, so the outside can't get in. Footnote 27. The shaman's occupation of the line of deterritorialization plays a crucial role in maintaining the dynamic equilibrium of the primitive socius. Delirium never becomes collective. Acts 222. Sphinx nightmare. Both filiative implosion and exorbitant alliance. An ancestral reanimation of chthonic horror, encrypted in germinal biocosmic memory, and thing from outside haunting miscegenous lines of alien traffic. Footnote 28. Hunter-gatherers populate a smooth space, but only by organizing upon it. Quote, the primitive machine subdivides a people, but does so on an undivided earth. End quote from Anti-Oedipus, page 151. Once again, this is to be differentiated from the war machine, which populates an undivided earth with a molecular multiplicity. There's something missing, a suggestive shape, like a dark side of his inner machine. Acts 3. Sector 0121. The theory of taboo involves a fully rigorous conception of horror, adequate to its specificity of regime, zone of effect, intrinsic variation, and to otherwise intractable phenomena, including sacred mutilations, curses, abominations, and becomings, unhuman, whether animal, submetazoic, amniotic, or unlife. In every case, horror designates a zone of intensity, abstract machine vector, which directly invests a virtual threshold of inflection, producing effects in advance of any reference to authority and indifferent to persons. You remember now when it cuts out automatically. True time-lapse horror finding yourself, axis, and it becomes you. Acts 3:1. Horror does not confuse the riddle with the secret. It is the answer that is cryptic. If 423 is man, then what is 423? This thing with only a number? This unknown becoming? The horror of the riddle lies in what it tells. Acts 3:1:1. Oedipus is necessitated, recursed, to guess correctly. It is man that goes on 4 legs, then 2, then 3. Yet Oedipus is identified solely by his lameness, his cryptic trait. The abnormality of limping changes to cryptic anomaly. Footnote 29. Quote, the Sphinx was an oracle, and therefore she was supposed to answer questions, not to ask them. Yet it is also true that oracular answers are often given the form of a riddle that requires interpretation, usually supplied by priests attending the oracle. It does not seem to me that every question needs or has an answer. But were it my misfortune to stand before the Sphinx with the dire prospect of never entering Thebes, I shall reply to her riddle, it is Oedipus. An oracle's questions and answers refer to the man who stands before it. Oedipus was exposed, a helpless infant with damaged feet, to crawl in the wasteland. He grew to be a man and a hero. His end was that of a blind wanderer in exile. End quote from Velikovsky, page 207. The perichesis of Soph even suggests that it was a deformity of Oedipus's feet that gave him the clue to the answer, and there is a tradition that Oedipus gave the answer by pointing to himself. Acts 3:2. Something is called, and then, finally, how terrible. The cause of the plague is Oedipus, who slew his father, mated with his mother. But that is not the thing, the horror, abomination when things on thread and a horrific becoming, they involve only components of occurrence, blocks of fate. Acts 3:3. The cause of the plague is you. EEG reads flat, terminal initiation. So what is 423, you ask? Glossary. Anthrobotics, the social effectuation of programmable technicity, corresponds to SF recapitulation of the Greek novum, real abstract, transchronic, equivalents of commoditized slave economy and capital-controlled intelligence engineering. Axiomatic, stratic mathematization based upon model realization segmentarity. The organization of laminar synthesis in accordance with principles of application, isomorphic resonance, and logicized harmonics. Axis, an applicable dimension, grid space meta-element. Axis, ultimate terrestrial order, pure capitalism as consummate idea of the geostrata and concrete historical sublime. True name for that which is really selected from the Earth's thought, by absolute occurrence. Encounter with the war machine, in its eschatological sense. Anthrobotic overlord of final domination. Capitalism, terminal configuration of terrestrial civilization, defined by sovereign axiomatics. Organizing capital, cash, segmentary economics, and technopolitical integration. Social precursor to Axis, atomization. Cipher, cryptonomic index, metrically overcoded by place value numeracy as magnitude marker. Chronos, extensive time temporality as standard non-curvature and reference for relative speeds. Axis formula, Chronos equals hyperdimensionality minus metastructure. Epistrata, stratic vertical supplements, add-ons, marking levels of axiomatic power. Extension, abstract domain of exceeded or hyposupplemented systems. Define the overall field of inferior instances, expressible content within stratic assemblages. Flatline, a concurrent trajectory of zero redundancy, zero dimensionality, and absolute or continuous speed, curvature, vortex, defining a smooth space in itself, intensity equals zero. Hyperspace, abstract superior instance of correlative to extension, real totality of Chronos plus all axis, actual plus virtual upgrades. Hyperspace elevator, intra-axis transportation apparatus. Order, extensive or sequence. Intensity, sheer sequential matter of the flatline. Metastructure, axis, epistrata. Sequence, intrinsic ordinality, defined intensively by elements of absolute gradient or speed curvature distributed in zero-dimensional smooth space, apprehended in extension as precursory, prototypic potential, implicit series providing ordinal matters and models. Smooth space, zero-dimensional plane of flatline intersection, exochronic unlimited now, non-segmentary time of concurrent multiplicity. Stack, laminar series of vertically ordered axis stages, constituting a stratic supersystem. Strata. 1. Tectonic, geological units of vertical deposition, constituting macro components of time registry. 2. Dynamic, automatic ordering machines, coinciding with laminar rezonings of D-zoned elements through production of hierarchical, D-platostatic intercompensation, stot, initial and defining configurations of state idea in terrestrial actuality.